So as you know, we've been working with the LaCuKnoS group for the past year and a half. There's been a number of virtual sessions as well as in-person sessions last summer. Unfortunately, we're having to do this one virtually, but it's a really exciting lesson, and I'll introduce Corey. Are you going first?
I'm going to go first, yeah, and then I'll turn it over to
Dr. Corey Buxton, who is the principal investigator and lead researcher on the project. Corey?
Great, thanks, Jay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good to see most of you again virtually. A few of you maybe for the first time. I'm Corey. Some of you have worked with me over this past year in some of the virtual PDs, and for others, maybe I just saw you in August. Next slide, Jay. So I want to take just a couple minutes to say a few overview things about the LaCuKnoS project, and I'm going to turn it over to Francisca to lead the forestry lesson. But some of you have heard me talk about that in LaCuKnoS, we sort of have this model of tools, practices, and model lessons. That's how we're trying to roll out what we do. And I just want to say a couple quick things about why this approach, why we think this is important, because we have a lot of content lessons, but LaCuKnoS is about content, but it's also about practices. And we know sort of from over time, looking at history, that humans use tools. We develop tools to solve problems, and that's sort of our greatest strength as humans. And those tools can be physical, but they can also be conceptual, linguistic. And we know that when we develop new tools and practices, it helps us see new possibilities for ourselves. So I think for students, we want them to see science as sort of a collection of tools and practices that they can apply to their everyday lives. And we focus on science and engineering, honestly, because so many of our problems, as well as the solutions that we face around the world today, are STEM related, as well as so many of the living wage jobs. We don't need or want everybody to go into STEM, but we want everybody to try on STEM and feel like STEM is an option for them. And honestly, there's a lot of good jobs in STEM and will continue to be. So one of the questions that we're really interested in LaCuKnoS is how can we best support students in applying and expanding these tools, linguistic, cultural, and knowledge building tools, so that they can make sense of their world, make good decisions, and figure out what to do with their lives. So we begin by embedding these tools into model lessons. And we have also these things we call practice briefs that try to explain the tools in more detail. And I'm going to be doing some narrated PowerPoints to share with you this spring to go into more detail. Next slide, Jay. So a few of you have seen this before. This is kind of the schematic of our practices built into this model. And in August, at the August workshop, we focused on the blue, it's sort of like a layer cake that builds up. So we focused on the blue ones. We talked about language choices and how we make choices based on topic, purpose, and audience, how we can support students in learning to use language more effectively. And we've got tools like language boosters, the summary templates, and the concept cards are some tools to help build this practice. And we talked about student grouping. And if you were in the August workshop, we did the role cards and the role play with the forestry. And that's an example of how we use groups intentionally. Next slide, Jay. And so in this workshop, we were trying to introduce two of the green practices, but we're just going to introduce a few bits and pieces today and then roll out some materials to explain these in more detail. The next language practice focuses on using all the modalities. So reading, writing, listening, speaking, viewing, visually representing, kinesthetic, multimedia, all the different modalities that we can use to make sense of science and engineering. So we'll be trying to demonstrate using a tool called multimodal talk moves, some of the ways that we can do that. And translanguaging is the idea of using all the linguistic resources we have, as well as those multimodalities. And together, it's about trying to think about what are all the resources we have to make meaning and share meaning, and how can we feel more comfortable expressing ourselves in class to sort of share that meaning. Next slide, Jay. And the last slide I want to talk about, we are not focusing too much on family engagement today, but of course, family engagement, family science nights, that's a big part of what we're about. We know that family science nights aren't new, but they can be improved. We have a lot of ideas for that. We're hoping to work with at least some of you in the spring to think about some other models of family nights. And we know, especially for folks in middle and high school, parent-teacher interactions tend to fade away as kids get older through school, but we know it's still super important to be connecting with families when kids are in middle and high school. So we have some tools to try to help us do that. That's a whirlwind introduction to some of the LaCuKnoS tools and practices. Let me turn it over to Francisca.
Okay, Thank you, Corey, and thanks everyone for being here this morning. I see some familiar faces. So some of you might have already heard a little bit about what I'm going to talk about the very first part of the lesson, because the lessons are connected to each other. But for the ones who not, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about why are we focusing in forestry? Why are we doing this all forestry related lessons? And I wanted to start by talking about how much forest do we have in Oregon. Oregon is very diverse in terms of forest and land use, but about half of Oregon is forest land. So we have quite a bit of forest in Oregon. However, the ownership is quite different. And we'll talk about why forest ownership really matters with, related to what happens to the forest. So about 60% of the forest is owned by the government, by the federal government, and about 20% is the large private companies, say those well-known Weyerhaeuser, the really large companies whose focus is basically just producing timber. Okay. Next, Jay. And with that 20%, and the other ownerships don't focus their primary objectives on producing timber. So with a really smaller amount of land, forest land, the majority of the wood is being produced. So we have the industry, which is the large owners, produce about 63% of about 63% of the timber in Oregon. So they are having to operate in a way that it has to be very efficient to be able to produce that much timber in a small amount of forest land. So there's a lot that goes into forestry to be able to reach those goals and be able to produce that amount of timber. Next. So we have a lot of different ownerships, which means a lot of different objectives. And also that includes and opens up for a lot of different types of careers for people. So we have so many different ways of working in forestry. We have wildlife biologists, we have on the logging side of things, we have forest engineers that care about roads and things like that. We have field foresters, procurement foresters who basically make sure that the sawmills get enough timber and the proper type of logs to produce timber. We have the firefighters, we have hydrologists. These large companies work with hydrologists to make sure that, they're working with the right practices when it comes to water. Stewardship foresters that work for, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and teaching. I am one, who teach here at the university, and I also teach to small woodland owners because I work for Extension. So there are so many different ways in which somebody can work in a field that is related to forestry. And that's why we believe that it should matter for everyone, who would like to have a career in natural resources. Next. The other one is fire. And I do understand that, on the east side of the Cascades, the forest is not the same as on the west side of the Cascades. It's different, and there are many areas that don't have forest at all. However, fires, are becoming more frequent, more severe, and are affecting absolutely all of us. And so, we all have a role in trying to manage the forest in a way that, it continues to be sustainable, and we really have to have different approaches to climate change and all the things that are happening these days. Next. So for the ones who came to the summer workshop, they might be familiar with this lesson. As I said initially, the lessons are tied together. So I'll talk about the first lesson that we developed that had to do with forest management, and then I will kind of transition into the lesson that we'll talk about today in more detail. Next. So first of all, why do we manage forests in the first place? Next. So forests provide so many different things. I mean, we think about timber, water, there's so many animals and other organisms that live in the forest and depend on it. We have also the recreation opportunities. I love hiking, and I love to have places to go where that have trees and that have that natural environment. They provide jobs, just like I was talking about different careers, wood products that we use every single day, carbon storage, and so many things. Next. And because of that, because they provide so many things, we as humans have managed the forest from the very beginning to meet our needs, our basic needs. And as time has gone by, our goals and needs have changed, and so has ownership. And I was talking about different ownerships and different owners having different purposes and different management goals for their forest. So because of that, unfortunately, many of these goals cannot be achieved simultaneously. If you want timber, there are other goals that might need to be minimized or changed to be able to meet all of those. So, and different landowners have different goals. I mean, I work with so many small woodland owners, and they have a very diverse objectives that some of them are just only oriented on producing timber. Some of them, I want to create habitat for certain species. So how do we decide, and how does a person who owns a forest or an entity that owns a forest decide what to do and how to do it? Next. So we have these landowners that have certain goals and different goals on their property, and we have a forester. Some landowners are more experienced, and they can pretty much do and make these management or these decisions by themselves, but I would say the majority hire a forester. And the forester basically works as somebody who can tell them, well, you have this amount of forest, you have this amount of land, and basically this is where these are your options. These things might be, you might be able to do things that that fit with your forest, and some of them you might not. And they just kind of like work together to make a plan for a forest. So in this lesson, what we did is that we had different roles, and we have the landowner, we have the forester, trying to figure out what the best way of managing this forest is, and make all those decisions together. Next. So this lesson included a property that had 4 different forests, and they all had, so one of them had oak in it, and mixed with Douglas fir that can be used for a certain purpose, and the other 3 had Douglas fir at different stages of growth and age. So depending on that, the landowner can do different things with them. So in one of them, which is called the Mighty Fir unit, is a unit that is 60-year-old, Douglas fir that is pretty much been managed for timber and is ready to be harvested. And the lesson that I'm going to talk about right now only focuses on that lesson. So basically the decision, the first lesson talks about, okay, how do we decide how to manage this whole land? But the second lesson focuses on one unit that is ready to go. How are we going to maximize the utilization of those trees coming out of that unit? Next. So just to give you a little bit of background. So the way that this works, when the trees, let's say the decision's been made, the trees are going to be cut, how do we cut them? And why? So the first tree is felled. Usually you have a hand faller or you have a piece of equipment that cuts the tree. So the tree is felled. Then the tree is transported into what's called a landing. This landing is basically a wide area that sometimes can be even a road. Sometimes it's a really tight spaces. But that's where all the trees are transported into. So they are cut into logs and then put into different sorts, okay, or different piles, if you will. And that is because, when you see a tree, the tree has different logs, different products, okay? So the tree in the landing is, they take the limbs off, which is called delimbing, okay? And then they are bucked, what is called bucking. So that bucking is basically cutting that tree into logs according to what is called a purchase order. And this is kind of a little bit more of a backstory about bucking, but basically the forester or the landowner will talk with somebody from the mill and tell them, okay, what are your prices and what are the lengths and the diameters that you take? And usually here at OSU Extension, we tell foresters or landowners to talk with 3 of them so they can have kind of different quotes. So these are the logs that are mill A is taking, these are the ones that mill B is taking, and these are the ones that mill C is taking. So they basically are trying, what the landowner needs to do is to try and find the mill that best fits the type of trees that they have. So they can cut the tree into logs in the best, most optimal way. So when that tree is cut, usually what comes out of it is saw logs, which are going to the sawmill. And then the smaller parts are usually called pulp logs. And those go into a different mill, which is the pulp mill. And they really don't care about the size or the diameter so much because those are going to be chipped and they're going to be, cut into tiny pieces to produce paper or other composites. So when I talk about those sorts or piles, those are usually piles that have either saw logs of the similar specifications or they have pulp logs that are going to go to a different place. So the process of cutting that tree into different logs is what is called bucking. And that's where this lesson focuses on, okay? But as I was talking about, these saw logs are usually going to be transported into one mill, and these pulp logs are going to be transported into a different mill. And usually they will, of course, they're going to make different products out of it. And that's why the size and the length are so important. Okay, I think that's the last one, Jay. Before going into the...
You want the lesson?
Yeah.
So before we get started on the lesson, I just want you to think about for a second what your experience has been with observing that part of the process where the trees are actually transported from the landing to the sawmills. Have you seen these transportation going on? And so I'm going to put a question in the chat, and if you would just respond to the chat and just share your experience. Maybe you have never seen logs being transported, or maybe you've seen them a lot, and just share what you have seen, what kind of logs, what the size is. So here's the question.
Yeah.
AJ says, I always get stuck behind the logging trucks on the road from Newport to Corvallis.
Yeah.
Yes, especially near Toledo. It always, yes, and I'm amazed at the way they're secured and don't slide around. So these are pretty big logs. And
Yeah, some of them are really big. And I had a picture of telephone poles on that little diagram. And you know, poles are a very specialty product, and you need really, really long, straight trees, and they are worth a lot of money. And sometimes those need specialized trucks to be transported. And sometimes, and you know, when I was just talking about forest engineering and roads, how do you know, if you've been into logging roads, they're not for the faint of heart, and they're wavy and steep. So when you think about really, really long logs coming out of those forests, like how do you make the turn with a truck that has, I don't know, 100-foot, you know, tree on it? So those are all things that need to be considered when you know, when somebody's logging or thinking about logging those type of trees. Yeah, Tillamook. Yeah, show logs are handled, processed, and shipped. Yeah.
so Shelby observed that her dad was a logger, and they used to have really different size logs than they have now. Most of them are now smaller and than they used to bring out of the forest. So that's an interesting observation.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for participating and sharing your experience with that.
Yeah, thank you. So now we'll move on into kind of a little bit more of the details of the lesson. And this lesson has two parts. The first one is more about learning concepts, and the second part is more about the backing process, okay? And I think that's why it's so important for, and at some point we'll talk about that it's important for students to kind of get themselves situated in where are they doing their exercise and why. So just like where in the cycle is this happening where the trees fell, this happening in the landing, is this happening at the mill? I think that's why it's just quite important to kind of show them that process through that little diagram. So the first activity for this lesson is to have students read the language booster. And if you can, so it's 9:42. If I can give you about 3 minutes to kind of skim through the language booster, so you can kind of understand of like what is it about, and then we'll continue on. I just get a timer going. Okay.
And if you want to open the lesson yourself, if you go to our the webpage that I posted in the chat and scroll down to middle high session, hit the plus button, you'll see the optimal tree utilization lesson plan. That's the same lesson plan we're looking at. You can feel free to open it there.
Okay, I'm gonna get the timer going. Okay, seems like most of you I see there already read it. So all the words I had to mention, all the words that are highlighted in there come with a definition. I don't know if you can scroll, Jay, and look at some of the concept cards. So they have concept cards that kind of describes what each one of those words are, because there are, more specifics to forestry. So for the ones who are not, familiar with those, and to have students understand better, we made those concept cards. So after students have read the language booster, we made basically two choices of an activity to follow after they read and discuss this language booster. And one option is to use the woodland stick. Did any of you remember using the woodland stick in the summer workshop by chance? Yeah. So that would be if you have the alternative of, having trees outside the school. Maybe you can take them out and measure height and diameter, and make that as an activity that will relate to what they're going to work with, in the rest of the lesson. As an alternative, if that's not possible, then maybe doing some sort of a tour and just walking around the school and looking at things that are made out of wood. That can also make students relate, okay, so there's a telephone post there, or the window frame is made out of wood. There are so many things in school that are made out of wood, paper, desks, and all those things. So they can relate, that all these products, all these things that they are using on every day, they're made out of wood, even if they're not living in a forest or in a heavily forested area, they can make that connection. So after they have kind of been through that, explaining to them, can you go back, Jay, to that diagram on the slide? The previous one. Yeah. So having them fully understand this process and where things are happening. And I don't know if you noticed that we basically separated where these things are happening. And one of them is, the first one is in the forest, right, where the trees fell and yarded. And then landing is still in the forest, but in this area where all of the logs are being piled up and then loaded into the trucks. And then they go in different trucks, right, to different sawmills. So the mills and the sawmills are producing all these final products that they were able to see, outside their school or in their classroom. So I think that is very important for them to explain them all of this, in that they will be focusing on that bucking or that, cutting the tree into different log products that is happening at the landing. So next is they have an activity that is kind of involves plasticine, and it's more like a hands-on activity, and is related to what is called the scaling diameter. Can you go to the scaling diameter, Jay? Thank you. So just to explain the concept, when a log gets to a sawmill, that sawmill cuts the log starting in the small end diameter. So logs have taper. I mean, I understand that sometimes it's hard to see. When you see a tree, it looks straight and it just looks like a perfect cylinder, but they're not like that. I mean, they taper and and when I'm talking about conifers, okay, like Douglas firs or pine. They're very tapered, and they have a tippy end. So even though we don't see it from when we're staying next to a tree, they do taper, and some trees taper more than other ones. So when somebody cuts a log, it has a small end and a large end. And when that log gets to the mill, it's cut starting on the small end, because they are trying to maximize the length of the product that they want to get out of it. So if they start from the large end, they will run out of wood, right? Does that make sense? So, and all of this is based on what is called the Scribner log rule. That is how the volume of the logs is determined, and also the base of payment for basically trading logs. So if you are a landowner and you are selling logs, your trees are going to be, the logs are going to be determined. The volume that you get out of them is going to be determined by the small end diameter. Okay, and this is all based on how many boards that are 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 inch thick can you fit in that small diameter. And I do have a model. Jay, if you can get the screen. As I have worked with small woodland owners, I made this styrofoam model, as you can see here. And this model basically represents, let's say this is the small end of a log. And here you have 10 of those boards that are basically inside of that cylinder, okay? So this is a 16-inch diameter log that has 10 of these. So, and this has 1 foot to represent that where the board ends. So for example, that chunk is 10 board feet, okay? So let's say if that log was 16 inches and 40 feet long, then I have 400 board feet in that log. Does that make sense? A little bit? Okay, yeah, well, so it is a concept that is kind of a little hard to understand, and that's why we decided that it was a good idea to have the students make a little model with plasticine, okay? So I made my own. So they will grab a little square of plasticine and make their own log. And this is the log that I made, okay? As you can see, it's very tapered. If you see a log in a log truck, you probably think it's straight, but it's not. In reality, it's kind of like this. It's not probably as pronounced, especially if it's a really long, large log. But imagine that this is a log. So if you want to have the sawmill cut it, right, and get the longest rectangle they possibly can get from here, they will have to start cutting from the small end, right? So what I did is I actually, we're gonna have plastic knives on the, yes, the carrot. Yeah, we thought about the carrot too. But we thought that we were gonna have to get knives to the students. We were a little scared about that. So, so in your kit, you're gonna get plastic knives. And what I did, I actually used this ruler. It also works, okay? So I used this ruler, and I don't know if you can see it there. So I cut, you know, trying to line up with the small diameter, so I don't run out of wood anywhere, okay? And I did that on one side, on the other side, and then I flip it on both sides, okay? So I can get the longest rectangle inside of the log as possible. So what I came up with is this. So I try and make it as similar as possible. The one I think is a little shorter than the other one, but so just for time. So as you can see, one is a square and the other one is how the log was supposed to be originally, okay? So then with this, students should be able to kind of understand why the small diameter is the one that matters. And you know, the other one is, this is the plasticine that I got out of it after I cut it. So this is all the wood, extra wood that, you know, this other log has. So if you think about it, you get a plastic knife. Yeah. Sorry, I was reading the chat. So one way of thinking about this, if you were the one who owns the logs and you're selling the logs and you are being paid by the small diameter. So the purchase orders have prices at different diameters and length. So if you're being paid by the small diameter, how do you feel about that? And that's something that maybe you can tell me in the chat, just to kind of tell me, like, how do you think this, is this fair to you?
So there was a question, Francisca, about what do they do with the waste, and does that factor in possibly to the cost? Do they pay for the extra wood to do something else with it?
They do something else for sure, but they don't pay for it. And just that's the way the log rule works. And if that's the way of all wood is traded here in the Pacific Northwest. There are other countries that use, cubic meters. So you have a different way of estimating the volume, but that's just the way it works. And I think the sawmills call it overrun. But yeah, it doesn't seem fair to the person who's selling, and I think it's been considered switch, but it doesn't seem like it's really being very popular. But because it would mean, it's just like, how would you make the entire U.S. go to the metric system? It's kind of like that. We're all used to it, so it is kind of a challenge.
So quick question, does that mean that the mill who is buying the logs doesn't pay for this overrun, but they sell it for other products like pulp for making paper or making OSB or some other sort of product?
Correct. And it is odd enough that, sometimes you can get a log with a certain amount of board feet in volume, and your product is bigger. It has more board feet, but it's because of that. Yeah. So, so the first part of the lesson is just to do this, and after this, they have an exit ticket, so they can to make sure that they understand the concept of the small and diameter, and that will lead to the second part of the lesson, which is bucking. Yeah, so for the second part of the lesson, they need to start by reading this background information, so they have a better understanding of, why is this so important and why they're doing it, okay? And in this case, for the bucking process, we'll focus on volume. So they will get a tree profile. I don't think you scroll. Yeah. So that would be, so it all starts, okay, we're focusing on this mighty fir unit in which all the trees are ready to be harvested, and we will take an average tree with a profile. And in this profile, what you have is diameter and length, okay? So for example, on this one at height 30 feet, you have 17 inches of diameter. So it will tell you what the diameter is every 2 feet of the tree. So that will help them later to figure out whether they can fit or they cannot fit a log in it, okay? And we focus on trying to maximize the amount of volume that they can get out of this tree. And they are given 2 different mills. And those 2 mills have some requirements. And this is the way it really works. It's not as specific as this. I mean, they usually have ranges of length, but in order to make it simpler, we said, okay, the minimum small end diameter is a certain amount. In that case, for example, for the first mill, it would be 5 inches for the small log and 12 inches for the large log, and they have a preferred length. So they will need to try and fit as many logs as possible within those ranges. So for example, if they try and get the first log, the large log, they need to be within the minimum of 12 inches in diameter. And they're going to try and get a 36-foot log within that. Okay. So they will go through that exercise and basically buck or cut this tree into different logs for both mills. And then there's a summary sheet in which they can kind of write down how much volume they get. So they can say, okay, the first log is 36 feet. The scaling diameter is, let's say, 13 inches. And then they can look out the log volume on a little table that follows, let's say, the scaling diameter is 13 inches and the log is 36 foot, then they get 220 board feet. So they pretty much look up in this table and then they write it down and say, okay, they get, let's say in total, they get 3 logs, and for the first mill, they get 660, and for the second mill, they get, I don't know, 720. And they will get a difference just because of the requirements of the mill for those specific logs. So the idea is for them to understand, okay, if we cut this tree in a way that will fit this mill, we'll get this amount of volume. If we cut it for this other mill, we get this amount of volume. And we want to get the logs to the mill that will utilize the most amount of volume out of my tree. And that is kind of the whole idea of this activity. At the very end of this lesson, there's an example that kind of walks you through the entire process. And because of the time, unfortunately, I'm not able to walk you all through this example because it will take quite a bit of time. But so there's guidance there to kind of do this exercise on a different tree so you can fully understand the idea behind this. And my plan is to also record a video so I can walk you through this exercise that is at the very end of the lesson. So what time is it? So it's 10:05. I don't know, Carla, if we should do the Jamboard.
Yeah, hi everyone. So we have, now that you've gotten a chance to just get a brief overview of the lesson, we want to hear from you as to just some thoughts about how you might use this in your classroom. And so we have, Jay's posted the link to a Jamboard for you to respond there and just, yeah, give us your thoughts about this lesson. Does it seem applicable to your club, and how might you use it either in your club or your classroom? And I think with that, once you're finished, then you'll be able to go ahead and take a break, right? Francisca, we're done after that? Or do you want him to come back? Okay, so.
We're done after that, and I am also happy to answer questions. I mean, I know that this is a very quick walkthrough, especially the second part of the lesson. But I just wanted all of you to kind of have a good sense of kind of what it is, more than the details. But if you have any questions about that, please let me know.
We did have a couple questions in the chat, maybe that you might want to respond to before we let them go. So Ken asked, isn't there also a cost factor? Aren't some log sizes paid a premium amount, or is it just a matter of maximizing board feet?
Absolutely. So we could have actually initially the idea was to include not only cost but revenue, because as those mills have different specifications for the logs that they want, they also have different prices. Okay, so there could be a mill that, you know, is paying much better than another one for the similar log. However, one is 50 miles away and the other one is 20 miles away. So then you have transportation costs that goes into play. So it's definitely in the end, it's definitely a money decision. But when we try and do that, it was just getting a little too complicated. So we decided to kind of view as this problem as, okay, how do we get the most use out of our trees, out of our logs? But in fact, there's, a third part of this lesson, if you will, that, that we can make available if there's interest to include all of that. Yeah, thank you for that.
The other question was, is there a benefit to growing quick growing trees like a poplar, which can be harvested multiple times versus a slow growing tree? Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. It really depends on the site. If the site can grow really fast, trees like poplars, and you can get a lot of rotations out of it, and you have a market for it, then yeah, it might be a better option. I mean, that definitely goes to the very end. Answer to that question is just an economic evaluation in which you need to consider, do you have a market for that wood? Do you have that market close enough so your money is not going to go away in transportation? And does the site, like soil conditions and moisture and all of that, are going to grow those trees fast enough so you can get your returns? So it's a site, kind of a site limitation, and also, do you have the market, and is your market close enough? For example, I did my thesis work on residues from logging, branches and tree tops and stuff like that. Can we sell it? Can we make a product out of it instead of burning it? And the answer is yes, but as of today, there are no markets. So a landowner will have to pay transportation to get it to a place where that can be processed into, another forms of energy.
So I have a quick question. There was a comment that Shelby made back where logs were larger in the past than they are now. When we were out doing the tour of the OSU research forest, Brett had, the forester, mentioned that OSU waits, I think they said 60 years instead of many other logging operations that wait 40 years. What is the economic benefit to having smaller trees that are turned over quicker versus larger trees that are take more time to grow?
It's economics. It's just economics, and if they are able to grow quicker and they are able to get more rotations, out of the same or similar amount of time, they would economically prefer to do that, because that's just like, it's economics. And also, if the trees get too large, then there are no longer mills that can handle them. So the size is good. Like, large trees are good to a point. Okay, so like a lot of landowners say, oh, I have these huge trees, they are worth a lot. And the problem is that the mills have changed their tools to fit the smaller diameter trees that are massively produced by the industrial landowners. So there are very few sawmills that take really large trees. And because of that, then it goes again to transportation. Are those mills that are able to take larger trees close enough to you that you can make it work economically?
I see Ken has his hand raised.
Yep.
Sorry.
Francisca, I would like to go back to your model. I was a little bit confused about the short, skinny sections on the top and the bottom of the log, and why they would figure in why they would count, if you know what I mean.
So are you going back to the slide, or
to your model, your physical model?
Yeah.
So Explain to me why those ones on the top and the bottom are valuable when they're not a foot wide. I thought we were trying to get a foot wide on those.
Yeah, well, you can fit them. So this one, the one on the top is a 1 foot, but it's cut by 2, just so that you can do, it can fit within here. Yeah, so these 2 are a 1 foot. It's just like cut, I think I cut 1/3 or something like that. But that's the way you can fit it on the edges.
So I guess the question maybe is more like, so those smaller or more narrow pieces would still be factored into the volume because you're still able to get an inch thick, but even though they're not a foot wide?
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the ones that are in the middle, they're 8, and then this is the 9th one is split, and the last one is split too.
So those 2 top pieces make 1 foot.
Right.
Does that make sense, Ken? Hope you just muted yourself again.
Sorry. Do they have to be a minimum width? I mean, because obviously maybe a 2x4 or something like that, right? So they have to have a minimum width to be of value.
Yeah, and this is not exactly related to the exact final products. It's just the way the rule is made. But yeah, it's not connected exactly to a final product. Yeah, thank you.
We got just a couple minutes if there are any further questions.
I just wanted to add real quickly, we have another lesson I mentioned in the chat that we developed on paper making to think about the pulp, and we are rolling it out with the elementary folks, but we're happy to make it available if anybody wants to do paper making. We've got the materials to do that kit as well.
That will be up on our website. It's currently not up there right now, but you will find it in the elementary section probably later today. So just a logistical questions. If you high school, middle school teachers, you're going to stay here. We're going to leave. And you'll have an RCRV section next. But I just want to thank the LaCuKnoS team and Francesca for all the hard work that's gone into this lesson. Remember, we're always here to support you in completing these lessons, so please reach out with any further questions you have.
I see a question.
Yep. Great to see everybody. So we're popping out now, Jay?
Yep, we'll be over in the elementary session.
Okay.
Okay.
See y'all later.
Hello, middle school and high school teachers. I'm glad to have you all here.
Jay, if there were any materials for the paper making, I bet we would all love to have them at the middle and high school.
There are a lot of paper making materials. Most of them are going out to the elementary this time. I have a feeling that we'll be doing that activity at the May teacher workshop. You know, not the best for doing it right away with your Smile Club, but getting those materials together for them. Because it does take some specialized materials for this version of paper making. We had done with the bioenergy project a different version of paper making that was less material intensive, but it didn't work as well because the paper didn't hold together very well. So you would like let it dry and then you'd pick it up and it would like fall apart. This is actually a much higher quality version. So we will get that to you. Looking forward to seeing you all later. I'm going to zoom to the next session. Enjoy the RCRV.